Hey everybody, and welcome to our deep dive. With Christmas just around the corner, it got me thinking, wouldn't it be interesting to kind of take a fresh look at the nativity story this time of year?
Yeah, for sure.
Especially, the humility surrounding Jesus' birth. We've all heard countless times growing up, Mary and Joseph, no room at the inn to manger.
Right.
But I think sometimes we get so caught up in the Christmas carols and the pageants and all that stuff, we maybe miss some of the deeper meaning behind those humble beginnings.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's easy to sort of get swept up in the heartwarming scenes, but when you really stop and think about it, God choosing those circumstances for his son's arrival, it's kind of a powerful statement.
It really is. It almost seems counterintuitive, right? You don't think the arrival of the Messiah, the King of Kings, would be, this huge spectacle.
Exactly. You would think there would be some grandeur there. And that's really what makes this choice so profound.
Yeah.
As Stephen Armstrong points out in his sermon, God deliberately chose to strip away all the worldly trappings of, power and prestige. And so Jesus, the heir to King David's throne, is born not in a palace, but in a stable.
It's such a stark contrast, and it's like God is intentionally challenging our preconceived notions of, what constitutes true greatness.
Yeah, it's almost like he's turning it on its head.
Yeah.
And Armstrong really emphasizes that this deliberate act of humility was a foreshadowing of Jesus's entire ministry.
Yeah.
It was like a declaration that his kingdom wouldn't be built on, worldly power or status, but on service and sacrifice and love.
So we're not just talking about, a charming detail of the Christmas story, right? This is like this foundational principle of Christianity that's woven into the very fabric of Jesus's life and message.
Exactly. Yeah. And Armstrong highlights that there are actually two types of humility we see at play here. First, there's the initial humility that leads us to recognize our need for a savior, to acknowledge that we can't save ourselves.
Right. It's that moment of surrender when we realize we need something greater than ourselves.
Exactly. But then there's a second type of humility.
Okay.
And that's the kind that marks a life lived in obedience to God. It's about continually choosing to put God's will above our own, even when it's difficult or inconvenient. And that's the type of humility we see reflected in Jesus' birth.
Okay, so how do we differentiate between these two types of humility in our everyday lives? It seems like they could easily get blurred.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first type, the humility that leads us to faith, is like that initial step, into this vast unknown landscape. It's a moment of awe and recognition. The second type, the humility of daily obedience, that's about navigating that landscape.
Okay.
Taking one faithful step at a time, even when we can't see the entire path ahead.
So it's not just about, a one-time decision, but about making countless small choices each day to align our will with God's map.
Yeah, and Armstrong is very clear that this doesn't mean we become passive or deny our individual gifts and talents.
Right.
It's about using everything we have, our time, our resources, our abilities to serve God and others.
Yeah, I'm starting to see how this concept of humility is much deeper than just, being meek or self-effacing.
Right.
It's really about surrendering our ego and embracing a life of service.
Exactly. And this ties into another important point that Armstrong makes.
Okay.
Humility isn't about achieving some, an impossible standard of perfection.
Right.
It's about radical obedience, about continually striving to align our desires with God's.
And this reminds me of the story of Peter rebuking Jesus, when Jesus began talking about his suffering and death. And Peter, even with the best of intentions, wanted to protect Jesus from pain.
Yeah, that's a great example. Even Peter, one of Jesus's closest disciples, struggled with this concept.
He did.
He was operating from, a human understanding of what was best rather than surrendering to God's plan. And as Armstrong points out, Jesus's response to Peter was pretty stark.
Yeah, it was.
He said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men."
Wow. That's pretty strong rebuke.
It is, and it really highlights the critical difference between, acting out of our own limited understanding and surrendering to God's infinite wisdom. It's about recognizing that our ways are not always God's ways, and that true humility involves letting go of our own desires and embracing God's will, even when it doesn't make sense to us.
So it's not about blindly following rules or suppressing our thoughts and feelings.
No.
It's about aligning ourselves with a higher purpose, with God's ultimate plan for our lives.
Exactly. And this leads us to a crucial question that Armstrong poses. Are we building a life driven by our own desires and ambitions? Or are we actively seeking God's will in every decision? Are we focused on our own comfort and security? Or are we willing to embrace the discomfort of surrendering to a plan that might be bigger and more challenging than anything we could have imagined?
That's a pretty profound question to ponder, especially as we head into the Christmas season.
Mm.
It's so easy to get caught up in all the festivities and kind of lose sight of the deeper meaning behind it all.
You're absolutely right. And as we continue our deep dive, I think it's important to keep this idea of radical obedience in mind. What might it look like for us to embrace the humility of Christ's birth in our own lives? What stumbling blocks, as Armstrong puts it, might we be clinging to that are preventing us from fully surrendering to God's will?
That's definitely something to reflect on. And speaking of reflections, one of the things that struck me in Armstrong's sermon was the way he highlighted Mary's response to everything that was happening around her.
Oh, yeah. When he points out that Mary treasured up all these things and pondered them in her heart.
Yes.
It's not just passive observation. She was actively engaging with this unfolding story, even amidst all these confusing and challenging circumstances.
It's such a powerful image. It makes you wonder what was going through her mind. She was so young, facing, such immense responsibility and scrutiny, yet she chose to find meaning in these events.
And I think there's a valuable lesson there for us as well. As we navigate the complexities of life, we can choose to approach our experiences with the same openness and thoughtfulness that Mary demonstrated.
Yeah, it's a great reminder that even amidst, all the chaos and commercialism of the Christmas season, there's this deeper story unfolding, this story of humility and sacrifice and ultimately redemption.
Absolutely. And that story, as we've begun to see, has profound implications for how we live our lives, how we make choices, and how we define success.
Well, on that note, why don't we take a quick break and we'll come back and continue our discussion about humility and the Christmas story in just a few minutes.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the humility of Christ's birth. Before we move on, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier, this idea that Jesus, as the Son of God, existed in glory with the Father long before his birth.
Yeah, Armstrong really emphasized that point in his sermon.
He did.
And it makes Jesus' decision to enter the world as a helpless baby all the more extraordinary.
It's mind-boggling, isn't it, to willingly leave that state of perfection and embrace the vulnerability of human existence. It really begs the question, what might we be holding on to that's preventing us from that same level of surrender?
Yeah, it makes you think about our own attachments to comfort, security.
Yeah.
Maybe even our own sense of self-importance.
Exactly. And Armstrong reminds us that this idea of, giving up everything dear is at the very heart of what it means to follow Christ. It's about recognizing that our lives are not our own, but a gift entrusted to us by God to be used for his purposes.
It's such a radical shift in perspective, isn't it?
It is.
Instead of asking what God can do for us, we're called to ask what we can do for God.
Precisely. And that brings us back to the story of Simeon, which we touched on earlier. He had spent his entire life waiting for the Messiah.
Right.
And when he finally encountered Jesus, he declared that he was ready to die because his purpose had been fulfilled.
His encounter with Jesus wasn't about personal gain or relief from suffering. It was about finding ultimate meaning and purpose in something far greater than himself.
And that's the kind of profound fulfillment that comes when we align our lives with God's will. It transcends any earthly circumstance or achievement. Simeon's story is a testament to the transformative power of surrendering to a purpose beyond our own limited understanding.
Armstrong also spoke about the importance of actively engaging with these stories, not just passively observing them. He used the phrase, pondering them in our hearts, echoing Mary's response to the events surrounding Jesus' birth.
Yes, and I think that's so crucial. It's about taking these stories and wrestling with them, allowing them to shape our understanding of God, ourselves, and the world around us.
So it's not just about intellectual knowledge or theological concepts, right? It's about allowing these truths to penetrate our hearts and transform our lives.
Absolutely. And this leads us to a very practical question. How do we move from simply admiring the humility of Jesus to actually living it out in our own lives?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It can feel so overwhelming to think about, embodying that level of humility in our everyday choices and interactions.
It can, and Armstrong offered some really helpful guidance on this in his sermon. He suggested starting by simply asking ourselves, who or what am I serving in this moment? Are our decisions driven by selfish ambition, or are we seeking to honor God in all we do?
That's a really helpful framework for making decisions, both big and small. It shifts the focus from our own desires to God's will.
And as Armstrong pointed out, those seemingly small choices, they have eternal significance.
Wow.
He reminded us that the things we do in obedience to God will follow us as crowns in the next life. What a powerful image.
It really does reframe our understanding of what true success looks like. It's not about accumulating wealth or accolades in this life, but about investing in what will last for eternity.
And that investment often starts in the most unexpected and humble places, just like Jesus' birth in a stable. God often works through the ordinary and the seemingly insignificant to accomplish his extraordinary purposes.
That reminds me of another point Armstrong made about the shepherds being the first to hear about Jesus' birth. They were considered the lowest of the low in that society, yet they were the ones chosen to receive this momentous news.
It's as if God was intentionally turning societal norms upside down.
Yeah.
He was saying true greatness isn't found in wealth, power, or social status. It's found in humility, in recognizing your need for a savior, and in responding to God's invitation with an open heart.
It's almost like God was saying the humble will inherit the earth, not in the sense of worldly power, but in the sense of spiritual understanding and intimacy with him.
Exactly. And that message, though, spoken over 2,000 years ago, is so incredibly relevant for us today. We live in a culture that values self-promotion, achievement, outward appearances. But the Christmas story invites us to embrace a different way of being.
It challenges us to reevaluate our priorities, to find joy in serving others, and to embrace a life marked by humility and radical obedience.
So as we continue celebrating this Christmas season, let's not just admire the story of Jesus' birth from a distance.
Right.
Let's allow it to challenge us, to convict us, and ultimately to transform us.
Let's embrace the humility of Christ and allow it to shape our priorities, our choices, our relationships. Let's choose to serve God rather than ourselves. And let's watch as he does extraordinary things through our seemingly ordinary lives.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful and encouraging. We wish you a Christmas season filled with the peace and joy that come from knowing the humble Savior who came to set us free.
Welcome back to our deep dive. I feel like we've uncovered so much about the significance of Jesus' humble beginnings, how they really challenge our conventional ideas about, success and greatness.
Yeah, it has been fascinating to kind of unpack these ideas, especially in light of, Stephen Armstrong's sermon.
Yeah.
It really prompts us to consider, how can we move beyond simply admiring Jesus' humility to actually embodying it in our own lives?
There's this misconception out there, I think, that humility is about diminishing ourselves or downplaying our accomplishments.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's what Armstrong was getting at in his sermon.
No, absolutely not. It's
Right.
not about denying our gifts or talents, but about recognizing their source. True humility acknowledges that everything we have, our abilities, our resources, even our very breath, is a gift from God.
So it's less about, self-deprecation and more about right perspective. We don't disappear, but our ego takes a backseat.
Precisely. And this shift in perspective has the power to radically change how we interact with the world around us. Instead of constantly, seeking recognition or striving to be the center of attention, we become more focused on serving others and advancing God's kingdom.
That makes me think about how humility could impact our everyday interactions.
Oh, yeah.
And Armstrong touched on that too.
He did. He gives some really practical examples. Humility can make us more patient listeners, more willing to forgive, more open to understanding different perspectives.
Right.
These are qualities that can have a ripple effect, creating a more peaceful and harmonious environment around us.
It's ironic, isn't it, that something as seemingly passive as humility can actually be so transformative.
Right.
It's not about weakness, but this quiet strength.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Armstrong also challenged us to examine how our actions and attitudes might be hindering others from experiencing God's love. Or are we clinging to pride, bitterness, or judgment? These things create barriers between us and others, preventing them from seeing Christ in us.
Yeah, that's a convicting thought.
Yeah.
Humility isn't just about our personal relationship with God. It impacts how we interact with everyone around us.
Absolutely. And building on that, it's crucial to remember that humility isn't a one-time achievement or a destination we arrive at.
Right.
It's an ongoing process, a daily surrender of our will to God's.
So it's like a muscle we need to constantly exercise.
Yeah.
You know,
Yes.
It takes discipline, intentionality, a willingness to keep learning and growing.
Armstrong even compared it to a musician practicing their instrument.
Oh, wow.
You know, it requires dedication and perseverance. We may not always get it right, but we keep striving knowing that God is patient with us in the process.
It's encouraging to remember that we don't have to be perfect.
No.
God meets us where we are and helps us along the way.
He does. And as we surrender to this process of becoming more humble, we'll discover, as Armstrong so beautifully put it, that, humility is the way to true greatness. For it is in losing ourselves that we find our true selves.
What a beautiful paradox.
Yeah.
We empty ourselves, and yet somehow we become more fully who we were created to be.
It all comes back to the heart of the Christmas message, doesn't it? God chose to reveal himself to the world not in a display of overwhelming power, but in the vulnerability of a baby born in a humble manger.
And in doing so, he invites us to embrace that same humility, to surrender our desires, and to find true fulfillment in serving him and loving others.
So as we move into this Christmas season and beyond, let's reflect on the profound humility of Christ's birth.
Yes.
Let's ask God to cultivate that same spirit within us.
It's a journey that will take us beyond the surface-level celebrations and lead us to the very heart of what it means to follow Jesus.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful and encouraging. We wish you a Christmas season filled with the peace and joy that come from knowing the humble Savior who came to set us free.